As I said, as of yesterday, I wasn't aware I was giving a second presentation, but I was talking to the organising committee last night, and we were all talking about the importance of coal to liquids, coal conversion to various liquid products. So I thought it would be appropriate to give a bit of an overview of some work I did with the Clean Coal Centre, which was looking at gasification-based coal conversion worldwide, but very much, for very obvious reasons, focusing in on China, where there is a major and growing program developing that technology, or at least there was until the coal prices and more particularly the oil prices started to collapse. This is the scope of what I'm going to talk about, a little bit about the rationale, look at the opportunities, particularly from the Chinese perspective, talk about the different conversion routes and their applicability, and then really focus in on the economic, environmental considerations and issues, and then really link it through to China's wish to try and tie in their development of coal to liquids with their wish to start some demonstrations, at least, of CCUS through CO2 EOR. Okay, why are we interested in coal chemicals programs? Put it very simply, you can start with a low-grade and low-value asset, which is coal, particularly low-grade coals. You can process that to produce a synthesis gas, and then by a series of different chemical engineering routes, you can end up with a wide range of products, which I've shown on the right-hand side of the slide here. The good thing about this is your initial asset, the low-grade coal, has a very low value. The end products that you produce can have very high values indeed. The sort of not-so-good news is that you require a large-scale process to make this work, so there's a very high upfront capital investment. And then there's the other factor, is the uncertainty, which relates to the fact that although you can make these products from coal, they can equally be made from oil or gas, and as I think we're all very aware from the discussions yesterday, there's a great deal of fluctuation in the prices of the products that would be made from oil and gas, depending on how those particular assets move in value. So while you can, from a forward planning point of view, can very clearly identify the costs of your coal, you can identify the high costs associated with the process, which gives you a good fix on what your end products would be from coal. You can't readily make good and firm predictions about how the cost of your coal-based product would stack up against the cost of products in the future from oil or gas. I think the other point to stress, when you have that situation and you're turning coal into these liquid or other products, you're probably doing it for the issues of security of supply. So this is very much a process that is dependent on strong government support, and I think that's why, for one good reason, the Chinese situation as it is, where they've developed a major program for these technologies. These points here came out of an IEA meeting in 2008 and were put forward by Sasol, to which I've added a few others on the next slide, and I think these still hold true. If you're going to develop a coal conversion project, you need large reserves of indigenous low-cost gasifiable coal. This isn't a technology you would apply to imported coal because it's driven by security of supply. That coal could be stranded, it could be low quality, or it could be the location that makes it difficult to utilize in any other applications. But so that in those circumstances, turning it into higher value products could be attractive. I will emphasize the next point again and probably again. Most important, you need a government behind you with the ability and the will to provide enabling support for what will be very large capital investments in a rather uncertain market. You also got to take into account, you may have this coal available, but if you are fortunate enough to have significant indigenous supplies of oil or natural gas, it may be a better investment to put your money there rather than into the coal conversion programs. You've got to really make a good fist of working out whether the technical and economics are going to be attractive. You also have to think a lot about what are the products you're going to produce. Are they going to be something that you will use within your own country, or is this something that you might find a ready export market for? Most important issue, this is a high infrastructure technology. You need infrastructure both for the supply of the feedstocks. I've already indicated it's a high capital cost technology for the processing equipment itself, and you've then got to consider the transport of the end products. Last but not least, you need to think about your institutional capacity requirements, to be blunt, particularly if you're a developing country, so that you've got the right people to run what are quite complex chemical engineering plants. With that in mind, the technology initially was established in South Africa at the time of the apartheid, and that was built up into a major program that made both synthetic fuels and synthetic chemicals. Though it's interesting to note that the chemical side is now operated through utilization of supplies of natural gas, which became available. But this is the basis of China's program. It's been doing, and this was established at the start of the current 5-year plan, 2011 to 2015. The aim was to establish a modern coal chemical industry. The way they went about this was to establish a whole range of reasonable size, or significant size demonstration projects, decided the best ones from the Chinese context, and then they've started to upgrade them to get economies of scale. And they've also applied the HELI approach that we talked about yesterday, where they're looking to improve the efficiency of conversion and reduce the environmental impact on the surrounding areas and so on. They're also locating these in areas where there's coal and where they believe there is adequate and sufficient water availability, because these technologies utilize a lot of water as well as coal. And they're also looking to put them in areas where they can extend the industrial chain to promote local economic and social development. That means makes jobs available for the local people. And they're very much focusing on the utilization and conversion of low calorific value coal. This is a very simplified map of China, different provinces of China. And what I've marked on there, this was work I did a couple of years ago, is the locations of the initial first wave of plants that was established in China. I've put in there a legend that shows the size of those plants in terms of their CO2 emissions. I've done that because I'll come back to that when I get onto the CCUS part. But you can see, I hope you can see, that quite a large number of these are very large plants. They're very large CO2 emitters, equivalent to a medium-sized coal power station. The pictures on the left, the top one is the Xinhua Baotao coal to olefins plant, one of the first of those that was built in China. And at the bottom, that's a picture of the coal to synthetic oil plant that was established by Xinhua and began operation in 2008, 2009. These are big pieces of engineering equipment. You can also see these initial plants were mostly on the eastern side of the country, but over in the province, in the brown-coloured province, which is Xinjiang, there's the first of the plants that were built, as I said, around about 2012, where there's very large reserves of low-grade coal and reasonable quantities of water. When I update that, as I will shortly, that will be covered with a very large number of plants, all of which have gone up in the last 2 or 3 years. Having said that, there is, as I've indicated, uncertainties regarding the coal conversion projects in China. I've said about the high capital costs and the uncertainty of the forward prices for oil and the derivatives. There's certainly concerns regarding water availability, because most of the coal that's being used for this technology is now located in the northern and northwestern parts of China. There's a recognition that these are high-intensity coal conversion processes which bring their own challenges. And there's also a discontinuity because the locations for the commercial scale units are considerably far away from the eastern and southeastern seaboard of China, which is where most of the industrial processes that will utilize the end products are located. This is some results that were released by the China Development Bank, where they were looking at break-even prices for the technologies that were being developed. This is showing the results for a gasification-based coal to oil process, which is the so-called indirect conversion to liquids, the ICL process, and on the right-hand side of that is a more direct process for comparison. The important point I want to stress here is it's showing the input prices of the coal that would be used in the process, and it's then showing alongside that the crude oil production cost at which you would have probably break even on the technology. At the time, coal was priced at about $90 a ton, which meant that the crude oil production costs for break even were around about $65 a ton. So a year and a half ago, when crude oil prices in China were about $110 a barrel, everyone was very happy and significant operating profits were being made. Now that the oil prices are down around about $35 a barrel, although the coal prices have fallen somewhat, they haven't fallen down to $15 a ton, and so the profitability of most of the processes are questionable at the moment. And while the processes are continuing to be operated, because the state believes in the strategic value of the program, it is hampering the forward planning and implementation of the full commercial deployment that was originally intended. But to put that in context, in a very short period of time, they have established a program which is utilizing about 180 million tons of coal a year, which is a significant quantity. This is a slide that shows the environmental considerations. This is showing the indirect coal to liquids process that I referred to, coal to olefins, coal to ethylene glycol, and coal to synthetic natural gas. And you can see here the number of tons of coal that it requires to, or standard coal that's required to make a ton of product. But equally importantly, the amount of water that's required in that process, and the CO2 emissions that would arise. For example, coal to olefins is a very important process in the Chinese context because olefins are a precursor to polyester and a number of other products that are major uses in China. And you can see that it takes nearly 7 tons of coal, 33 tons of water to make a ton of the olefins, and also results in 5.5 tons of CO2 being emitted. The other important process, or they're all important, but another particularly important process is the synthetic natural gas. And here you can see it, again, there's considerable water usage. And though the CO2 emissions are not as high there, of course you're making synthetic natural gas, and when you burn that, there's going to be further CO2 emissions. This is important if you look at the little slide in the bottom right-hand corner, which shows the relative abundance of coal in the different provinces. The provinces in red, which are Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang, are basically where the highest concentrations of coal are, but there are also lots of the parts of those provinces, they're water stressed, so this is an issue. This is coal to olefins, the process, for those that are interested. They established units initially of 500,000 tons of product a year. By 2015, 9 projects of that kind were fully operational, and the further 8, in fact, have just about come online. So they have an annual capacity of over 9 million tons of this very important product. The drop in oil price has hurt the profitability, and there's competition from lower cost imports being produced from gas. Having said that, they have the capacity to produce almost 80% of the total monomer capacity that's required in China. So they're close to self-sufficiency. Coal to SNG is strategically very important. China still has plans to attain 10% of its energy needs from gas by 2020. This was touched on by several speakers yesterday. There was talk about a downturn in gas requirements. I'm not entirely convinced that's correct. What I think is happening there is there's a limitation on how much gas they can import through the various terminals that are available to them, and producing SNG from coal is a demonstration that they have other ways of doing the process if needs be. Again, there was plans to reach 50 to 60 billion cubic meters of synthetic gas production by 2020, but because of the drop in the oil and gas prices, that may not be achieved. Coming back to the slide that showed where the early projects were located, one of the benefits, one of the functions of the process is you end up with a concentrated waste stream of CO2. That's just a consequence of the chemical processes that are going on in the reactors. So you've got your CO2 concentrated, you can just repressurize it a bit, and as many of these plants are located in oil-producing areas near oil wells, and because China has such a demand for oil to the extent that every barrel of oil above a certain level now, they have to import, anything they can do to increase the production for their existing wells is important. So that CO2 offers a very promising route for enhanced oil recovery by CO2 injection into the wells. A couple of the major oil companies have already tried this successfully up to about 150,000 tonnes a year. But what we're talking about here is several million tonnes a year coming from these coal to liquids plants. There's also been work done by the USA that looks at the overall carbon footprint from these, and at the time this was done that looked quite encouraging. But certainly within China there is a belief that enhanced oil recovery through CO2 use is a possible win-win solution between the operators of the coal to liquids plants, the coal to chemicals plants, and the major oil companies themselves. With that in mind, my last but one slide is a picture of the cover of a report that was produced by the Asian Development Bank and the Chinese government, which was looking at the whole issue of carbon capture and storage, and this roadmap focuses on the large coal to chemical plants as an initial way through to establish enhanced oil recovery, and then as technologies improve, moving on to the power sector. Listed on the right are a number of plants that we evaluated. I say we because I was privileged to be involved with the ADB and the Chinese side on putting this report and the program together. And more importantly, or very importantly, at the COP21 meetings, the Minister of Finance from the Chinese government, a number of senior officials from the National Development and Reform Commission, and senior directors from the Asian Development Bank publicly together released this report into the public domain with the announcement that the intention was to now go forward on some of the projects that we put together. How quickly that's going to happen, I'm not entirely sure, but it does show, I think, quite a major shift in the Chinese attitude to CCS than was there previously. Last slide. I think it's interesting that this is a technology, if you think back to the prerequisites that I set out, this is a technology that has a lot of potential. But apart from South Africa and China, it hasn't really been taken up. And I would be very interested to hear the views of our Indian friends here about why that is not happened, because if it's appropriate to China, I would have thought it would have been appropriate in the Indian situation. And I know there are a few early projects, relatively small projects going ahead. But when you compare that to what's happened in China, it'd be interesting to discuss the differences. But I certainly think China offers a template for large-scale coal to chemicals programs, and particularly from a Chinese government point of view, it has, or certainly has, the finance that can underpin these projects, particularly including the infrastructure needs, because these are very significant. Having said that, water availability is going to remain important, but the need to limit CO2 emissions, and this being a way to take this forward, is going to prove an interesting balancing act. And certainly I know the Chinese intentions are to continue to grow this sector, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. Very brief overview. I hope you found it of interest. Thank you for your attention.